Woo! Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this panel today. Kind of in the spirit of the Solana vibe, I'm going to start with a meme like, yeah, go science. Because science, I think, is, like, in many ways, the backbone of society. And even the backbone of crypto, if we think about it. So if we go all the way back, cryptography is a science. And everything that happens in crypto, or all of our cryptographic networks like Solana, are based on scientific innovation. Fun fact, that was actually funded by the US government. A lot of those kind of cryptographic algorithms were developed in the Second World War. And today, I'm joined by two incredible commercialization leads, one in Europe and one right here. You said you had to take a 5-minute cab ride?
Yep.
Yeah. Before I'll let them introduce themselves as well. My name is Paul Kohlhaas. I'm the CEO and co-founder of an organization called BIO. BIO is a launchpad, the first launchpad on Solana for decentralized scientific communities, projects, and increasingly also agentic science systems. Yeah, so this may be the first time that you're hearing of DeSci, but you're going to hear a lot more, especially since we have the pleasure to work with incredible institutions like Newcastle University. But before we dive right in, Marc, could you briefly introduce yourself and your kind of role in funding and commercializing research?
Sure. So Marc Sedam, I'm the vice president for the commercialization arm of NYU. NYU has a research base of about $1.5 billion a year, so we're the size of a small pharmaceutical company in terms of research. And I manage the intellectual property commercialization and startup formation on our campuses in the hospital system in Midtown, the university campus downtown, the engineering school in Brooklyn, and our campuses in Abu Dhabi and Shanghai. So I joke that the sun never sets on New York University intellectual property. And in the office ourselves, in the university, we have several translational research funding programs. We have a venture fund. So we put to work about $6 or $7 million a year translating early science into something that might be marketable, commercializable, and licensable, either to a startup company or to a large existing company.
Matt, well, would love to hear kind of your role in commercializing research and a little bit about Newcastle University.
So I work as a tech transfer manager at the University of Newcastle, which is in the United Kingdom. Sorry, is that too loud? So I spend most of my day working with academics trying to find inventions that we can commercialize. And it's focused on a medical faculty, so things like diagnostics, medical devices, and therapeutics. So a lot of these inventions, you don't just find them in the university. It takes a long time to develop them once you're with a researcher who wants to commercialize their research. So I also spend a lot of time bringing in funding from external sources, mostly from government, so research grants, but also from industry and more recently from DeSci, which is an interesting prospect that we're exploring at Newcastle.
Yeah. So you guys were very early. I think one of the second university on the planet that was funded through decentralized science. Mm-hmm. Marc, I want to get to us in a little bit and talk about the huge funding cuts that have actually happened this year from the NIH. So about 2.2 billion was cut in funding, affecting thousands of scientists across the United States. And this could slow down the pace of research for years to come. But before we actually get to talking about why DeSci is so much needed, Matt, I'd love to hear about some of the earliest experiences, how it's been like pioneering this model. And I'll take a quote from you that happened just after we funded the first research project. So this was in 2021, and this is a research project that is focused on autophagy activators. So it's in the field of longevity. A lot of people want to age more slowly, right? Once you make a lot of money in life, you're going to ask the next question is like, how can I live longer, right? And so longevity is a really important field for many people. Pump science, for instance, that many of you know, is also focused on longevity. And so we had the pleasure of working with Matt. And normally, it can take 6 to 12 months for an out licensing deal. Marc, is that correct? What's your average time?
To do a license, I would say 3 to 6 months.
3 to 6 months. So that means 3 to 6 months of negotiations before the university gets the money, and then probably another month or two maybe before the researcher can start her research. In this case, we did it in 4 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the researcher, Victor, he applied for a grant and it came to our office, and you are right, it typically takes 6 to 12 months to get a research grant from government. It's a very long process. It starts generally with an expression of interest stage. There's a panel, there's a bunch of people that look at the grant, and it takes a lot of time. I mean, these applications can be 50, 100 pages long, a lot of work. And at the end of the day, if they fail, then that's a lot of lost time. And they, I think researchers spend, you say, 80% of their time applying for funding and not doing science, which is not great, right? So with VitaDAO, it took 4 weeks from the start of that project getting on our desk to getting a contract and the money in the bank, which was really quite impressive. Yeah. And it was just a very, very slick process. And within that process, there was also a lot of due diligence, which you guys did, which was really quite good. So you looked at the grant. You outlined 6 areas, I think. So IP, commercial potential, scientific background. And that was really good for the community that were involved in funding that work. So yeah, it was a really good process. Yeah.
And then I'll add some more context for all of you that are listening about this. So this was funded in 2021, late 2021. We're still very actively working and progressing that project. So you fund a piece of research, and then it takes a bit of time until you get first results. It was then turned into a first-of-its-kind tokenized research project on chain. So there was a liquid token created around it. You can find it. It's called VitaFast. It's being migrated to Solana soon. So in total, the project raised about 300,000. And it's fully kind of community-owned. So it's owned by a DAO, and it's owned by a global community of token holders. I can't reveal fully about this yet, but we're currently in talks kind of with a major government to pioneer a first clinical trial in longevity for this. So this drug will actually be put in humans to test whether it really extends lifespan, which is huge in the biotech world if you think about it. Typically, it can cost upwards of 50 million, 80 million to get a compound into a clinical trial approval. And for this to happen fully in a decentralized way is groundbreaking. So fingers crossed that'll happen.
Yeah.
Yeah. Marc. So I just mentioned earlier about these huge budget cuts. How do you think they'll affect NYU, and how do you actually think they'll affect the scientific research ecosystem in the United States?
Yeah. I'm going to, since we're future talking, these are my thoughts, not NYU's thoughts, just to be clear. So, the government priorities have shifted. There's a lot of, the traditional funding model is under duress. I won't say under attack, but under duress. And I think what you're going to see is there are areas of science that have traditionally been funded that won't be funded now for lots of different reasons. There's a change in stance on vaccines, for example. And so I could see that there are areas that where the use cases tend to be the commercialization tends to be a little lighter, meaning things like we talked earlier about antimicrobial resistance or vaccines that need to be cheap and available. Those are really hard to fund under traditional models because if you finally get something that actually works and the commercialization happens, and it might need to be a dime a dose in order for the vaccine to be usable. So I could see places for this type of funding to fill those gaps and to make sure that that area of science doesn't start to lose, because once you stop funding an area, it takes not that much time for something to disappear and a long time to rebuild it. So I could see these kind of models doing a lot of bridging. What it looks like in the future, I think, is universities are going to have to be a little more flexible than we are. What'll be interesting to see is how government is flexible, because a lot of the conditions under which universities usually work and do research in the United States, they're dictated by some of the federal laws of ownership and transfer and intellectual property transfer. So I wouldn't say that we're hamstrung by doing things a particular way, but I'm saying we're conditioned to do things a particular way because the laws have been in place for quite some time. So I'm actually curious to see if the federal government kind of loosens up a little bit on what they allow the institutions to do and how we could do transactions a little bit differently. I think a lot of people would encourage that, to see a little more creativity in terms of how we get things out into the market. Because in the end, universities generally don't look at commercialization as money-making enterprises. I mean, we definitely make money and we like that, but we really think about how we change society. And so we can't generate a revenue stream if society isn't changed, if somebody doesn't use the thing, if the vaccine doesn't get used, if the antimicrobial compound doesn't get used. If there's no use, then there's no revenue, and if there's no revenue, the university doesn't benefit directly.
Yeah.
So we really think about it as, how do we accelerate and advance science to get into the world to make humanity better? Anything that does that, I think we'd certainly be open to figuring out.
Yeah. So we just talked about the role of kind of public money, let's say from the NIH coming in to fund early stage university research. Are you familiar with Andrew Lowe's work?
With who?
Andrew Lowe.
No.
He's a researcher at MIT. He famously published a thesis called the Megafund thesis, how a lot more early stage research could be funded. He also did research about how much blockbuster drugs actually originate out of academia in the last 10 years. Oh, yeah. And so he found that 20 of the last 30 blockbuster drugs in academia originated in academia. And so pharma actually, like the whole pharma industry that has come into being, actually desperately needs this innovation to come out. What I think could be really interesting is essentially for the public to come in, fund early stage work. But yeah, I'm curious on your work on that, take on that, Marc. You must have worked with kind of with pharma on out licensings or gotten interest from them over time. How do you think it actually affects their business model?
I couldn't hear the last part. I'm sorry.
Sorry. How do you think it affects the ability of organizations like the NYU to actually put medicine on towards commercialization?
Well, so I think the issue is really about the ownership of the intellectual property, and that's, I mean, a lot of the things that you talked about with existing companies, I'm not picking on them, but your Pfizers and Gilead Sciences of the world, is they want to make sure that they have full control of the asset in order to do something, because they don't want to find out they're on the verge of $1 billion molecule and somebody else raises their hand and says they have ownership of it. So I think one of the challenges that DeSci has to deal with is, yes, everybody wants to invest, and yes, everybody wants a piece of the revenue stream, but that actually adds complexity to the transaction, right? So finding a way to make sure that people are get a return for the investment that they make, but they don't necessarily have control over how that asset kind of goes forward in the future is going to be the balance, because it's kind of like venture. If you've got 75 people on the cap table and you need to make a decision, you got problems. If you've got 30 people who own a small piece of the intellectual property and you're trying to do a transaction, do you have to talk to all 30? Do you get to do what you want with it? So it adds a level of complexity. So I think in terms of funding the early science and getting things moving, it's tremendously powerful. But in the end, the vehicle that's going to get that thing into market is probably going to be either a very well-powered startup company, but more likely, especially in the pharma and biotech industry, it's going to be one of the top 50 companies, and they're going to want to see clarity on things. When we have, just for example, if we have two academics arguing with each other about who did more in a project, that can derail a deal, right? So if we've got 30 people with an ownership interest, that's going to have to be ironed out well in advance so that they know that they've got control to bring that thing to market.
Yeah. You raise a really important point, which is like, I think token models that are now coming new into the market need absolute clarity, how they work from a legal perspective, from a financial and, as we say, like tokenomic perspective. It's one of the reasons I think, I really like memes. I've always liked memes. However, I think it's a loss that a large part of the crypto ecosystem has kind of gravitated just towards trading memes when, hey, why not trade science? But if we want people to trade science, and if we want scientists or institutions to put their science on chain, we need really clear legal and tokenomic models. I'm personally really grateful that we have had a huge change in the US administration, both on the SEC, but also broadly the administration towards much clearer legal models. And so that's one thing that we're really working on.
I think the big thing to think about is that a lot of people confuse ownership with control.
Yeah.
And you can have ownership with limited control. You can have control with limited ownership, and to never confuse the two. We have that, like a university who owns an asset once we license it, the company really has control over what happens to the asset. Only if something goes terribly wrong can we maybe grab some of that control back, but we don't care because it's under control. So finding a way to get that theme through this kind of funding, I think would be really important.
Yeah. Matt, so you've had direct experience already with, I think, a world that can often look quite scary to people. Essentially what Marc is just talking about is like, how did, when we first approached the university after the first kind of out licensing around like, hey, how do you feel about tokenizing the research project fully, meaning we distribute tokens or ownership or governance rights to anyone on the internet, basically. What were discussions like internally at that point, and how do you feel it's played out in practice?
So I think we did have a lot of conversations internally about the tokenization of the project, and it was quite hard to explain how that worked mechanically, especially with ownership. And one of the points raised was, how can you have 50 or 100 people having a part ownership of a project? It doesn't really work. But what we ended up doing was piggybacking on existing processes. And it sounds quite boring, but we do a lot of contract research with industry. And in the end, we badged it as another form of contract research and pushed it through the process that way. And that seemed to work quite well. In terms of the whole tokenization, I can see its merits, but I think there's commercial models that you could explore, maybe a revenue share back to the university, ownership going with the university, but having control rights. So there's a lot of room to maneuver, but I think it was it's hard to get this concept across to a lot of people in the university because they're just not used to it, and that's going to be a long educational piece for you guys to have to work through. Yeah,
100%. I think also one of the biggest opportunities, though, actually for ecosystems like Solana to enter a completely new vertical. So we're currently speaking with some of the best scientists across the US because they've been affected by these budget cuts and funding cuts. Like leading MIT researchers, for instance, hopefully soon, maybe with NYU. And you'd be really surprised that small amounts of funding can actually go really large, at least for what crypto is seemingly small. Marc, maybe to close us off, looking into the future, what's some of the exciting research that some of your scientists are working on, and maybe what are some of the funding amounts that they need?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly at NYU, AI and machine learning is the big area of research that we're focused on, and that application goes across the entirety of it. So, in silico drug discovery, how we use patient information, de-identified moral, ethical use of the information that we have in the treatment of patients, to train models to improve healthcare. So those are some of the areas that I think are really exciting for us.
Yeah. Okay. Matt, any closing thoughts? Well, what would you like to really see DeSci achieve this year?
So I think one of the biggest points about DeSci is you build a community up around the researcher, and it really does help the researcher to move from the lab into the real world, because you get people within that community who are actually experts in certain areas, and that's worked really well in Victor's case, especially on the medchem side. So I can see that as being a real advantage. And also opening up science to the public, I think, is a really big point, especially in the UK, because impact and social engagement is a big thing.
100%. I think that last point, you'd be really surprised, maybe as a last comment, DeSci is really about moving science on chain so that it can massively accelerate. A huge issue for scientists is often that they just don't get input from people, or simply not enough people care because the research is invisible, right? And so a lot of these, what actually happened to Victor's project, in a way, imagine if it was suddenly run in a Reddit forum where a lot of people can give comment, make suggestions, but also those people have financial stake now in how the research progresses. And in Victor's case, that has turned out extremely well. I think, again, if a clinical trial can get approved for that, fingers crossed this year, that could be a monumental moment. And I think it'll begin showing that actually funding research through DeSci can massively bring down industry costs. With that, I want to give a massive thank you to Solana for putting on this amazing event, and to Marc and Matt for joining us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.